I buried my husband 4 years ago. I watched the flag being folded, felt the weight of it in my hands, heard the 21-gun salute ring out over a cold Virginia hillside. I told my son his father was a hero who wasn't coming home. So when I turned around in seat 14C and saw Nathan sitting 2 rows behind me very much alive, wearing a stranger's face like it belonged to him, I understood something I had never let myself consider in 4 years of grief. Someone had lied to me, and I was going to find out who. The seatbelt sign was still lit when Noah went quiet beside me. He'd been chattering the whole boarding process, thrilled about the window seat, thrilled about the vacation, thrilled about anything that wasn't the inside of our house in Arlington. Then, mid-sentence, he just stopped. His small hand found my wrist and gripped it hard enough that I looked down at him before I looked at anything else. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice had dropped into a register I didn't recognize, something too old for a 10-year-old. "Dad's sitting 2 rows behind us." I laughed because that's what you do when your child says something impossible. I told him he was thinking about Dad because we were finally taking the trip we'd always talked about as a family, the one we never got to finish planning. I told him grief plays tricks on people, even smart people, even brave people like him. But his hand didn't loosen, and there was something in his face, a certainty that 10-year-olds don't fake, that made me turn my head anyway. I've commanded soldiers under fire. I've briefed generals without my hands shaking. I have sat across from men who wanted me dead and kept my voice level the entire time. Nothing in 22 years of service prepared me for what happened when I turned around in that airplane seat and looked into my husband's eyes. It was the hair first, the way it had grayed slightly at the temples, exactly the way I'd imagined it might if he'd lived long enough to gray. Then the way he sat, shoulders squared, spine straight, a posture the Army puts into a man and never quite lets go of. Then his watch, the one his father gave him, the one I specifically remembered the funeral home returning to me, in a small velvet box because it hadn't survived the water with him. Then the ring. His wedding ring on his left hand, catching the cabin light. For 1 full second he looked back at me. I have relived that second more times than I can count since. There was no shock in his face, no confusion, no double take, none of the things a man does when he sees a ghost of his own making. There was only a terrible, quiet recognition, and then he turned away, deliberate and controlled, like a man closing a door he'd known was unlocked. I didn't sleep for the rest of that flight. I didn't hear the safety briefing, didn't taste the coffee the flight attendant handed me, didn't feel the plane descend until the wheels hit the runway and jolted me back into my body. Noah held my hand the entire time and didn't ask me a single question, which somehow frightened me more than if he had. When we landed, I made myself walk slowly through the jet bridge, made myself keep my breathing even the way I'd trained recruits to do under stress. I caught one more glimpse of him near baggage claim. He wasn't alone. A woman walked beside, younger, dark-haired, her hand resting on his arm, with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She said something, and he laughed, actually laughed, a sound I used to know better than my own heartbeat. And then they were gone, swallowed by the crowd like they'd never been there at all. I stood there with my son's hand in mine, and my dead husband's laugh still hanging in the air, and I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I would not chase him through an airport. I would not scream his name in front of strangers and give him the chance to vanish again before I understood anything. 4 years ago, the Army taught me that the worst mistake in an ambush is to react before you assess. So I would assess. I would gather everything I could before I let him know how much I already knew. Noah didn't speak much on the shuttle to the resort. He kept his eyes on the window watching palm trees blur past, and I kept my eyes on the aisle watching for a face I now knew was a lie. My mind was already working through it with the cold clarity I used to reserve for operations planning. Someone had helped him disappear. Someone had signed a death certificate. Someone had let me plan a funeral for a man who was at that very moment boarding a resort shuttle with another woman's hand on his arm. The bus doors hissed open at our stop, and I helped Noah down the steps, my legs steadier than they had any right to be. I was reaching for our bags when I felt that prickling awareness at the back of my neck that I hadn't felt since my last deployment, the sense of being watched, or of watching someone who didn't know it yet. I turned toward the resort entrance just as the same shuttle door opened again behind us. Nathan stepped off alone this time and walked directly toward the same lobby doors we were headed for. I have spent my career reading people who don't want to be read, insurgent commanders, foreign attachés lying through polite smiles, men who could hold a rifle steady while lying to my face. So when Nathan walked past me in that lobby without so much as a flicker of recognition, I understood immediately that this was not a man caught off guard. This was a man executing a plan. I didn't follow him directly. I checked Noah into our room. First, told him to order room service and watch whatever he wanted, and made sure the deadbolt was thrown before I left. Some instinct, the same one that used to tell me when a convoy route felt wrong, told me my son needed to be behind a locked door while I did what came next. The front desk was easy enough. I've spent 2 decades extracting information from people who had far more reason to withhold it than an 18-year-old resort clerk with a name tag that said Brianna. I told her I thought I recognized an old friend, described him, asked which room he might be in, so I could leave a surprise note. She checked the system without much hesitation. Room 412, registered to a Daniel Carter. I stood there in the lobby with that name sitting like a stone in my chest. Not Nathan Scott, not even close to Nathan Scott. A completely different identity, one clean enough to check into a resort without a second glance from anyone. This wasn't a man hiding from me by accident. This was a man who had built an entire second life brick by brick with enough care that it had survived 4 years without cracking. I went back to the room, waited until Noah was asleep, and called Michael Turner. Michael had been our family's attorney for almost 15 years. He'd sat beside me at the funeral. He'd handled the life insurance payout, the survivor benefits, the trust fund for Noah's education. When I told him what I'd seen, there was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. "Kimberly," he finally said, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual courtroom polish. "Are you certain?" I told him about the watch, the ring, the name on the resort registry. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and careful in a way I'd never heard from him before. "If Nathan is alive," he said, "everything we filed was fraud. The death certificate, the insurance claim, the trust distribution. Do you understand what that means legally for you, for Noah?" I understood better than he thought. If my husband had faked his own death, I hadn't just buried a man who wasn't dead. I had unknowingly built a criminal case against myself with every form I'd signed in good faith, every check I'd deposited, believing it was compensation for a genuine loss. Michael's instructions were direct. Do not approach him. Do not confront him. Do not let him know how much I'd already pieced together. He needed time to quietly determine what we were actually dealing with before I did anything that couldn't be undone. I agreed mostly because some cold, disciplined part of my brain agreed with him, even as every other part of me wanted to pound on the door of room 412, until someone answered for 4 years of grief that apparently hadn't been necessary at all. I didn't sleep that night either. Somewhere around 1 a.m, I gave up trying and stepped out onto the balcony, needing air, needing the ocean noise to drown out my own thoughts. The resort grounds were quiet below strings of lantern lights swaying gently over the pool deck, palm fronds ticking against each other in a light breeze. That's when I heard his voice. It came from somewhere near the garden path beneath my balcony, low and unmistakable, a voice I had heard whisper apologies and promises and bedtime stories to our son for 7 years of marriage. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, the particular way he always dropped his volume at the end of a sentence like he was letting you in on a secret. I gripped the railing and looked down. He was standing near the hedges, phone pressed to his ear, and even in the dim light I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing over them like a man checking his six. Then, as if he'd felt my eyes on him, the way I used to feel a sniper's scope find me in training exercises, he looked straight up. Neither of us moved. The distance between the balcony and the garden couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like the entire 4 years stretched between us. In that gap, every unanswered question, every night, I'd cried into a pillow so Noah wouldn't hear every time I'd told him his father died a hero. I waited for something, shame, an apology mouthed silently up at me, anything. What I got instead was almost worse. He simply held my gaze for 3 or 4 seconds, his expression unreadable in the low light, and then he turned and walked back into the hotel without a single word, without a single gesture, like a man closing a file he'd already decided was finished. I stood on that balcony long after he disappeared, the ocean air doing nothing to cool the anger building in my chest, and one thought settled over me with absolute clarity, colder than anything I'd felt since the day they told me he was gone. He hadn't looked surprised to see me at all, which meant somehow, someway Nathan had known I would be here. Sleep never came that night, so I did what I've always done when sleep abandons me before an operation. I got up, made coffee I didn't taste, and started working the problem the way the army trained me to work any problem. Observe first, react later. Nathan had built a life sturdy enough to survive 4 years of scrutiny from an insurance company, a life insurance underwriter, and an 8-year-old boy's grief. A life like that doesn't crack, because a woman glares at it from a balcony. I needed more than a name and a face. I needed proof solid enough that no one could tell me I'd imagined the whole thing. I left Noah with the kids' club at the resort the next morning, a decision that cost me more than I let on to the counselor who checked him in. He didn't want to go. He kept asking when we could talk about what he'd seen on the plane, and I kept telling him soon, baby, soon, in a voice I hoped sounded steadier than I felt. Then I found a bench with a clear line of sight to the lobby entrance, and I waited the way I used to wait outside compounds we weren't cleared to enter yet, patient and invisible. Nathan came down around 10 alone, dressed like a man with nowhere urgent to be, and something in me recognized the tells immediately, even though 4 years had passed. He chose a table with his back to the wall. He scanned the restaurant twice before sitting. He kept his phone face down and checked the exits more than a man on vacation ever should. This wasn't relaxation. This was a man who had spent 4 years staying alive by never fully trusting a room. I followed him at a distance for 2 days, the kind of quiet surveillance that used to be second nature to me on deployment, except this time the target was the man I'd married at 26 in a small chapel in Georgia, with his mother crying in the front pew. On the second afternoon, he met someone. An older man, silver-haired, expensive, watched the kind of understated wealth that never needs to announce itself. They sat at a corner table away from the pool crowd, and I watched Nathan slide an envelope across the table with the practiced discretion of a man who'd done this before. I couldn't get close enough to hear everything, but I got close enough. My phone was already recording in my pocket, the microphone angled toward their table as I pretended to read on a lounge chair 20 feet away. Fragments came through when the wind cooperated. Account, documents, don't let her find out. That last phrase landed in my chest like shrapnel because I understood immediately who her was. I sent the recording to Michael that night along with everything else I'd gathered, and by the next morning he called with information that turned my suspicion into something far heavier. Using contacts, he wouldn't fully explain to me. Michael confirmed that Daniel Carter wasn't just a hotel registration name. It was a fully documented identity. New passport, new driver's license, new social security number functioning, filed real enough to pass any check a government database could run. He didn't just disappear, Kimberly, Michael said, and I could hear something close to horror in his voice. A lawyer's horror, the kind that comes from realizing exactly how deep a case goes. Somebody built this for him. This isn't a man who panicked and ran. This took planning, resources, help. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 4 years of widowhood, 4 years of raising our son alone, 4 years of carefully not falling apart in front of Noah on the anniversaries and the birthdays, and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when grief ambushes you out of nowhere, and it turned out someone had engineered all of it with the same precision you'd use to plan a covert operation. I had spent a career learning how men disappear behind false papers in war zones. I never imagined I would need that knowledge to understand my own husband. That evening, I saw him by the pool bar alone for once, and I let myself look at him properly for the first time since the airplane. He'd lost weight. There were lines near his eyes that hadn't been there before, the kind grief carves into a person, except his grief apparently ran in a very different direction than mine. He reached up absently to adjust his collar, and that's when I saw it. His wedding ring, still on his hand. He'd turned the band around so the plain metal faced outward instead of showing whatever might have been engraved on the inside, a small, almost invisible act of concealment, the kind only someone who'd once memorized every detail of his hands would notice at all. I remembered the day we picked that ring out together, remembered him laughing that he'd never taken off a piece of jewelry in his life. And here he was committing to one forever. He was still wearing it. 4 years of fake name, a new woman on his arm, an entire manufactured life, and he still hadn't been able to take off the one thing that connected him back to us. I didn't know yet whether that meant something or nothing, but I filed it away the way I filed away every other piece of this puzzle, and I promised myself I would find out exactly what kind of man could build 2 entire lives, and still not be able to let go of the first one completely. I told myself getting close to Laura was strategy, not cruelty. I needed to understand what she knew, how deep this lie went, whether she was complicit or just another casualty of Nathan's careful architecture. I found her by the pool the next afternoon reading alone while Nathan was off doing whatever it was he did with his mornings now, and I sat 2 chairs away with a magazine I never opened. She was easy to talk to, which somehow made everything worse. Warm, quick to laugh, the kind of open, unguarded kindness that made it obvious within minutes she had no idea what she was actually part of. We talked about nothing at first: sunscreen and the resort's breakfast buffet and how humid the afternoons got, and then the way conversations do when 2 women let their guard down near water, it drifted somewhere more personal. She mentioned Daniel. Told me they'd been together almost 3 years, that he ran some kind of consulting business, that he traveled more than she'd like, but always came home. I asked as gently as I could manage while my pulse hammered in my ears whether he'd been married before. He was, she said, her voice softening with what looked like genuine sympathy for a story she believed completely. His wife passed away. Some kind of accident, I think. He doesn't talk about it much. No kids, though. I think that's part of why it hit him so hard, nobody left to hold on to but himself. I kept my face perfectly still, a skill I'd built over 22 years of briefings where showing the wrong emotion at the wrong moment could cost lives. Inside, something in my chest cracked clean in half. He hadn't just erased his death, he'd erased his son. Erased me. Erased 7 years of a marriage and 10 years of a little boy's entire existence, folded it up and tucked it away like it had never happened. So cleanly that the woman sitting across from him every night believed she was comforting a childless widower instead of a man who had abandoned a family that was very much alive. I excused myself before she could see my face change, and I found somewhere private to stand and breathe until the shaking stopped. That evening, Nathan found me on the path back to our room, stepping out from the shadow of the garden wall like he'd been waiting there. Noah's small hand was in mine, and I felt his fingers tighten the instant he saw who was standing in front of us. "Please," Nathan said, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since the day his own father died. "Not here." I didn't answer him. I couldn't have, not with Noah standing right beside me, not with 4 years of rehearsed anger suddenly jammed in my throat with nowhere to go. Nathan looked at Noah, then really looked at him, and something moved across his face that I hadn't expected to see, something that looked almost like it might break him in half right there on the garden path. Noah looked back at his father with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. Not fear, not confusion. Something closer to grief, fresh and immediate, like he was watching someone die a second time in front of him. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. It was as if some invisible line had been drawn on the pavement between them, and both of them understood instinctively that crossing it would break something that couldn't be put back together in a hallway at 9 o'clock at night. Nathan broke first. He turned and walked away without another word. His shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen on him before, not even at his own father's funeral. Noah held it together until we got back to our room. Then the second the door clicked shut behind us, he came apart, entirely sobbing into my shirt with the particular violence of a child who has spent years being brave for his mother's sake and finally doesn't have to be anymore. I held him on the bathroom floor because it was the closest surface, rocking him the way I used to when he was an infant, and colic kept us both awake until dawn. "He's alive," Noah kept saying between gasping breaths like the words themselves were a wound. "He's alive, and he didn't come home. He didn't come home, Mom. He was right there, and he didn't come home." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, not really. I just held my son and promised him the only thing I could promise honestly. That I would find out everything, every piece of it. that whatever had made his father disappear, whatever justification Nathan had built for himself over 4 years, I would drag every inch of it into the light until there was nothing left hidden. It was well past midnight before Noah finally cried himself to sleep in my arms, and I carried him to bed the way I hadn't needed to since he was 6. I stood in the doorway of our room afterward, looking out at the dark resort grounds, and that's when I noticed him. A man in a black jacket, out of place in the tropical heat, standing near the far end of the garden wall, with his attention fixed entirely on the path Nathan had walked minutes earlier. He wasn't watching me, he wasn't watching Noah. He was watching Nathan, and something about the stillness in his posture told me he wasn't doing it out of curiosity. He came to my door at 2 in the morning and I almost didn't open it. I stood there with my hand on the deadbolt for a long moment, Noah asleep in the next room, every rational instinct telling me to leave it locked and let Michael handle this through proper channels. But some older, more stubborn part of me, the part that had loved this man for 19 years before any of this happened, needed to hear whatever he'd come to say directly from his mouth. He looked smaller than he had on the airplane. Older, too, in a way that had nothing to do with gray hair or the lines around his eyes. He stood in the hallway with his hands shoved in his pockets like a man waiting to be sentenced, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the careful control I'd watched him wear like armor for the past 3 days. "I need you to listen to all of it," he said. "Before you say anything, please." I let him in, but I stood between him and the hallway to Noah's room the entire time, a silent boundary neither of us needed spoken aloud. He told me about Richard Hale. The name meant something to me instantly, a business partner from years back, someone Nathan had worked with on logistics contracts before. I'd fully understood what those contracts actually involved. According to Nathan, 4 years ago, he'd discovered documentation buried deep in shipping records he wasn't supposed to have access to, proving Richard was running an operation far larger and far darker than legitimate freight consulting. Money laundering through shell companies, smuggling routes disguised as commercial shipping, financial fraud stretching across 3 states, and Nathan believed into places with far less patience for loose ends than American courtrooms. He said Richard found out what he knew within days. "He didn't threaten me directly," Nathan said, and his hands were shaking now, something I'd genuinely never seen from him before, not even during his worst deployments. "He didn't have to. He mentioned Noah's school by name. He mentioned your unit's rotation schedule like it was casual conversation. I understood exactly what he was telling me. I sat down because my legs stopped being reliable. I asked him why he hadn't come to me, hadn't gone to the police, hadn't done any of the 1,000 things a rational person does when threatened, instead of manufacturing his own death. "Because I did the math like a soldier," he said quietly. "Not like a husband. I thought if I disappeared completely, if there was nothing left connecting me to either of you, you'd both be safe. I thought a clean death was safer than a messy investigation that Richard could see coming from a mile away and retaliate before anyone could protect you." He told me the rest in pieces, like each sentence cost him something physical to produce. A contact from one of his old logistics jobs, someone with connections in a world I never wanted to know existed, had helped him fake the accident and disappear with new documentation. It was supposed to be temporary, he said. Weeks, maybe a couple of months, until he could quietly funnel evidence to federal investigators without exposing his own family to whatever Richard might do in retaliation. Then he said the part that made something in my chest go cold and still. Weeks turned into months, turned into a year. Every time I thought about coming back, I convinced myself it wasn't safe yet. And then I convinced myself you and Noah were better off without the danger I'd bring back into your lives. I told myself that was protecting you. I know now it was cowardice wearing protection's clothes. He reached into his jacket and set a small object on the table between us. A USB drive, unremarkable, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. He said it contained everything. Account numbers, shell company registrations, names of people connected to Richard's network, some of whom he said occupied positions that would surprise me. I didn't touch it, not that night. I told him I didn't forgive him, that forgiveness wasn't something 4 years and one confession could purchase back, and he nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and had no argument prepared against it. But I told him I would look at what he'd given me, because whatever else was true, if even part of his story was real, it meant our son had a right to know his father wasn't a hero who died at sea. He was a man who ran, and was now trying badly and late to stop running. He left before dawn. I sat alone in the dark with the drive in my hand for a long time before I finally called Michael. Michael flew in himself 2 days later rather than trust anything to a phone line, and he spent an entire afternoon locked in a hotel business center with a laptop and the files from that drive. When he finally came to find me, his face had the particular grayness of a lawyer who has just confirmed something he desperately hoped wouldn't be true. "It's real," he said, sitting down heavily across from me. "Kimberly, this isn't a story he made up to save himself. The shell companies exist. The transaction patterns match known laundering structures. I had a contact cross-reference 2 of the names against active federal case files." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Richard Hale is already on somebody's radar. Nathan's information could be the piece that finally closes the case." I looked out at the ocean through the hotel window, thinking about 4 years of birthdays without a father, 4 years of a little boy asking why other dads came home from deployments, and his didn't 4 years of grief that turned out to be built on a lie constructed however desperately to protect us. Whatever Nathan's intentions had been, the truth was finally surfacing, and truth I had learned a long time ago in places far more dangerous than this resort always demands a price from everyone connected to it, whether they're ready to pay it or not. Agent Rebecca Collins found me 3 days later, and I knew who she was before she introduced herself. There's a particular way trained investigators carry themselves, a stillness that isn't quite relaxed and isn't quite tense, and I'd spent enough years around intelligence officers to recognize it instantly in the woman who approached me near the resort's business center with a leather folder tucked under her arm. She worked for the insurance company that had paid out Nathan's life insurance policy 4 years earlier, and she'd been quietly tracking irregularities in the account for months long before I'd ever seen him on that airplane. A flagged transaction here, a biometric mismatch at a border crossing there. Small threads that pulled together had led her to this exact resort at this exact time, which meant my careful, private investigation had been running parallel to a federal one the entire time without either of us knowing. "I'm not here to arrest anyone today," she told me, sitting across from me with the kind of calm precision I recognized from my own briefings. "I'm here because the pieces are finally coming together, and you're sitting on information that could either close this case or complicate it significantly. I'd rather you help me than force me to work around you." I thought about Michael's warning about protecting myself and Noah from a legal mess neither of us had created. Then I thought about Richard Hale, whoever he really was, and the fact that he'd apparently been comfortable enough with violence to threaten a 10-year-old school schedule as leverage. I made my decision faster than I expected to. I gave her the drive. Everything moved quickly after that, faster than I imagined the machinery of federal investigation could move. Rebecca's team cross-referenced Nathan's documents against evidence they'd already gathered independently, and within 48 hours, agencies I hadn't even known were involved began coordinating an operation to bring Richard Hale in before he could disappear the way Nathan once had. Nathan came to me the morning they moved on Richard. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't. And he told me he was going to cooperate, fully testify against Richard, accept whatever came next, for the false documents and the fraud, all of it, without asking for leniency in exchange. "I'm done running," he said. "Whatever this costs me, I'm done." Richard Hale was arrested at a private airfield less than 6 hours later, apparently attempting to leave the country on a chartered flight the moment word reached him that his network was compromised. Rebecca called me that evening with details I hadn't expected to receive. "Professional courtesy," she said, given how central my cooperation had been. Federal agents had recovered records tying Richard to laundering operations spanning 3 states, financial fraud affecting dozens of unknowing investors, and enough evidence to keep prosecutors busy for months building the case. Nathan's own reckoning came more slowly, and in some ways more painfully, because it played out in front of me instead of somewhere distant and abstract. Faking his death meant fraud. The new identity meant falsified federal documents. The insurance payout I had unknowingly collected meant restitution neither of us had planned for. Michael worked for weeks alongside federal attorneys to untangle exactly what Nathan owed and to whom, a process that stripped away every trace of the tidy fiction he'd built with Daniel Carter's name. I sat in a conference room during one of the preliminary hearings, watching my husband, the man I'd married in a small chapel in Georgia, answer questions about wire transfers and falsified death certificates in the same steady voice he used to use briefing convoy routes. Laura wasn't there. I learned later she'd left him within a week of federal agents showing up at their shared apartment, unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one now facing federal charges for engineering his own disappearance. I felt nothing when I heard that. No triumph, no vindication, just a tired, hollow kind of clarity. Nathan looked at me once during that hearing across the conference table, searching my face for something I wasn't sure I had left to give him. I held his gaze the way I'd learned to hold gazes across negotiating tables during deployment, steady, unreadable, giving nothing away that I hadn't already decided to give. Every choice has a price. I told him afterward in the hallway outside, the only real thing I said to him that entire day. You made yours 4 years ago, now you're just finding out what it costs. He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing days earlier, somewhere around the moment he handed me that USB drive, and finally let the truth outweigh whatever fear had kept him running for 4 years. There was something almost peaceful in watching him stop fighting his own consequences, even as I understood exactly how much wreckage those consequences would leave behind for all 3 of us. That night, back in the hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed while Noah slept beside me. His small face finally relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since the airplane. I thought about the 4 years I'd spent believing I was raising a fatherless son, the funeral I'd planned, the folded flag I still kept in a box in our hallway closet, the countless nights I'd told him his father died protecting something, when the truth was infinitely more complicated than either heroism or cowardice alone could explain. Michael called late that night with one final piece of information. Nathan had requested something through his attorney, a request Michael felt obligated to pass along, even though he understood I had every right to refuse it. Before the formal sentencing hearing next month, Nathan wanted to see Noah. One last time on his own, without lawyers or agents, or the weight of a courtroom pressing down on either of them. I lay awake long after that call ended, staring at the ceiling, weighing 4 years of anger against my son's right to say whatever he needed to say to the father who had let him grieve a lie. I said yes to the meeting, not because I'd forgiven Nathan, but because I understood something about my son that Nathan still seemed to be learning. Noah deserved the choice I never got. He deserved to decide for himself what his father's face meant to him now, without me making that decision on his behalf, the way everyone else in this story had been making decisions for us for 4 years. We met at a small park near the federal building chosen for its neutrality, its lack of memories either of us needed to protect. I stood back by the car and watched Nathan walk toward the bench where Noah was sitting, his hands jammed in his pockets, his shoulders carrying a weight I recognized because I'd been carrying my own version of it since that flight. He knelt down in front of our son. Not sat beside him, knelt lowering himself to Noah's eye level the way you do with someone you're afraid of losing entirely if you don't get this exactly right. "I'm sorry," he said, and even from 20 feet away I could hear how raw his voice was stripped of the careful control I'd watched him maintain through hearings and depositions and federal questioning. "I know sorry doesn't undo any of it. I know I don't deserve for you to even be sitting here listening to me, but I need you to know I'm sorry, Noah, for all of it." Noah didn't answer right away. He sat there studying his father's face with the same unnerving stillness he'd shown on the airplane weeks earlier, like he was searching for something and hadn't yet decided if he'd found it. The silence stretched long enough that I almost stepped forward, almost intervened the way I'd spent 10 years intervening to soften every hard thing life put in front of him. Then he spoke quiet and steady in a voice that sounded older than his 10 years had any right to sound. "I already learned how to live without you." It wasn't cruel. That was the part that undid me, watching from the car with my hand pressed against my mouth. There was no venom in it, no childish attempt to wound. It was simply true, delivered with the plain honesty only a child can manage. And it landed on Nathan harder than any federal charge had. Nathan's composure broke completely. He didn't try to hide it, didn't turn away the way he'd learned to during 4 years of maintaining a careful, controlled fiction. He just knelt there on the grass and cried openly, while our son watched him with an expression that held equal parts grief and something that might eventually, given years and patience, grow into forgiveness. I cried too, standing by that car, though I made sure Noah didn't see it. Some tears are for the person you're grieving, some are for the family you thought you had. I think mine that afternoon were for both at once. The sentencing came 4 weeks later. Nathan's cooperation with federal prosecutors, combined with the evidence that ultimately dismantled Richard Hale's entire operation, earned him a measure of leniency. The fraud charges alone wouldn't have allowed. Probation, community service, full restitution of the insurance funds, which meant years of his life dedicated to paying back money that never should have been paid out in the first place. He wouldn't serve prison time, but he would spend a long time proving through nothing but consistent, unglamorous effort that he intended to become someone worth trusting again. Richard Hale received no such leniency. Federal prosecutors secured a lengthy sentence, the kind that ensured he wouldn't be threatening anyone's family from behind a shipping contract again for a very long time. Watching that verdict read aloud gave me a strange, quiet satisfaction. I hadn't expected less about revenge, and more about the simple, exhausted relief of knowing the danger that had shattered our family was finally permanently contained. Laura never came back, and I never learned much more about where she went after that. I hope wherever she is, she found someone whose entire life wasn't built on a lie she never got to help right. As for Nathan and me, we didn't rebuild what we'd lost, because some things once broken in exactly this particular way simply can't be reassembled into their original shape. But we found something else, something smaller and more honest. We became parents who showed up for the same recitals, sat 2 seats apart at the same parent-teacher conferences, coordinated schedules with the careful, business-like courtesy of 2 people who both loved the same child more than they'd ever loved being right about each other. Nathan started over from nothing, a new job, a small apartment, weekly visits with Noah that he never once missed, slowly, painstakingly earning back a fraction of the trust he'd spent 4 years destroying. I stayed in the Army. I kept serving the country I'd sworn to protect, kept raising our son with the same steady discipline that had gotten me through every hard year of my career, and kept learning slowly that peace doesn't always look like the ending you imagined when you were young and in love and certain your life would follow a simple, predictable shape. 4 years ago I buried a husband. This year I buried a marriage. And strangely, impossibly, that second burial gave me something the first one never could. It gave me peace. I want to know where this story finds you tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.